In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Blue Merle. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. I have seen this described as a gray-blue, but what I see in the writing is gray, and the chromatography is kind of brown, and the swatch is kind of maroonish brown, kind of. It would be easier to go with no color expectation. Frequently, as gray is what I see in the writing, that's what I'm going to go with calling it. There can be some tone variation by pen, but there's not tons. The same goes for the shading. There can be, but there's not tons. So there I'm confused by this ink, but not by grays. As grays go, it's difficult. See, this is not a gray that I love, but I don't hate it. I can see using it. I'm just not sure that I can see getting, to wanting a bottle of it because it's just odd as a color. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a D-like Alpha with a Fude type nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we see gray. That's why I'm staying with gray. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does do a little bit of shading. You see it in that, you see it in depends, you see it in formalist on the third line, even the letter A on the third line. So it does shade fairly decently. It doesn't really get to that pencil gray that I would like, but it's not very far off. Looking at the broad nib, it starts much darker. The ink had sat in that pen for just about 2 days before I wrote with it, and it really, in the very beginning, was much darker. It lightened up through the writing. Now, it didn't feather, it didn't spread. The tone in general is darker than we had with the fine. It does still manage to shade fairly well. You see about halfway through the second line, it starts to become about what I would expect from this in its writing. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone that a majority of that broad was in. We get no feather, no spread. We get a little bit of shading. Less shading than we had with the broad, but it still is there, just not as nice. I don't think it's looking as good, as similar as it is. I don't think it looks as good as the broad. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, we have no problems. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Lamy All-Star with a fine nib. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib. A Lamy Safari with a 1.1 stub. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, it is a lighter gray tone than we had on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering or spreading, it is giving a little bit of shading. It stands out more in the shading like you see on the end of Einstein where it gets much darker, but in fact, in like the word theory, if you look how it goes lighter to darker, a nice mid-tone, lighter, darker again at the Y. It does shade, but very gently and fairly consistently. Looking at the broad nib, it is only a little bit darker than we had with the fine. It is a little lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, no spread. We get a little bit of shading that comes up in the cross of the X of exists, in the S of is, or at the end of whole on the second line. So it is still holding on to some shading and doing it fairly well. Looking at the stub nib, we have about the same tone that we had with the broad on this paper, and it is still a little lighter than what we had on the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, no spreading, very light bits of shading. The shading that's happening is very minor, but it is definitely there. It stands out better in a couple of spots, like the end of the D on hand on the second line. But the majority, it's like from a mid-tone to a lighter tone. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting. This works really well. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get tiniest little bits of shading. I'm not going to really say that it is shading, though we do see a few spots that it does happen. Once again, we get where the slight tone change of the paper is making an effect on what this ink looks like. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the fine on this paper and lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does have tiny bits of feathering that are occurring, but not something that is even a big deal. You really have to be looking at it to spot it. You can see it on the B of burning. You can see it when you get to the fifth line of B on burned. It's the last word. You see it on asserts on the TS. There's no spread and only a little bit of shading is happening, though more than the fine. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the broad on this paper. Quite a bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. We have still tiny bits of feather, but they're not a big deal. We have no spread happening. We do have a little bit more shading than we had in the broad, which had almost none. You more see it on a word-to-word thing. Appear seems just a little darker than order just underneath it, and living seems just a little bit lighter than order directly above it. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and have no problems. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get to have no feathering and no spreading. We get to only have tiny little bits of shading show up. Nothing other than that. It's really only in a few spots, so it's barely worth calling shading. I think the color here, if it was on a finer nib, could look like I was writing with pencil on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the fine on this paper, quite a bit lighter than it was from the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get much better shading here than we've had in a little bit. You see it in and time and absolute, put in jeopardy. So it shades pretty well. I'm very happy with how it looks on this paper. Looking at the stub nib, we get just a tad bit darker than it was with the broad on this paper, just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Still doesn't feather, still doesn't spread. It does shade, but it shades very gradually into lighter and darker tones. Take a look at proceed on the second line where it starts darker, little lighter on the R, little darker on the E, through much darker on the DE at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding and ghosting is not a problem at all here. We can easily write on the back of this page. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Bookbinder's Ground Rattler Snake. Here is Caran d'Ache Infinite Gray. Here is Mont Blanc 90 Years Gray. Here is Papier Plume Oyster Gray. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is a tad bit, just a tad bit, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get a tiny bit of feathering that is very manageable, a tiny bit of spread that is very manageable. We get absolutely no shading. I think it just looks like you're writing with a fat pencil here as a result of the spread. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the fine on this paper. Quite a bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. We do get feather, we do get spread. Both of those should be expected at this point. We don't get any kind of shading, which can be a good sign for this paper, because not shading on this paper means it may not be bleeding. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone that we had on with the broad on this paper. Lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering. We do get spread. We do not get shading. Let me take that back a couple of spots, like the RT of physicists on the top line. You see it a little bit. The H of the on the third line, you see it just a little bit. So I guess it is shading a little bit. Bad news, perhaps. Looking at the back of the page, there were a couple of spots with the broad and one spot with the stub that it did bleed through and touch the page underneath. Seeing the back of the page, we understand why, because there's a lot of ghosting you can't write back here. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Ackerman, their number 2 Resident Blau. Here is a green ink by Zenzoy, their green. Here is a purple ink by Geherban, their Larmes de Cassis. Here is a magenta ink by Robert Oster, their Claret. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine. It kind of looks like a cement kind of gray here. Not bad. If it was a cement gray, I would actually call this very nice. It does feather, which we would expect. It does spread, which we would expect. It does not shade, which we don't normally expect it to do. I think the gray that we're seeing here, although it's not the gray I normally go for, is very nice. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the fine on this paper, a lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it does feather still. Yes, it does spread still. No, it is not shading. That little bit of difference, it still kind of looks like concrete. You know what it looks like? It looks like a nice, clean piece of concrete that is wet. Not like wet concrete, just wet with water on top of it. Looking at the stub nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the broad, which is that wet concrete, like water on top wet. It is a lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade. I'm not going to call this a bad tone of gray here, although it's not really the tone for me. Looking at the back of the page, you can see where I circled a bunch of dots that it did touch with the stub and with the broad. And seeing the back of the page, you can see why, because of the extreme ghosting, you can't write back here. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? I think this is a solid performing as a gray from any nib on just about any paper. I think a medium to dry flow fine gets about the closest to pencil, kind of, and that's really what I would prefer with a gray. So I'm going with a dry flow fine. I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.